Bring this meeting to, yes, okay, well.
La seule chose, par contre, quand
The only thing is that when we merge the two panels, it's that we end up just having 2 rounds of 5 minutes instead of 6. Could you repeat, please? Well, the only problem is that when you merge the two panels, there are 2 members here that end up with 2 turns of 2.5 minutes instead of an extra turn of 6 minutes. So I was wondering if you could organize something different.
And on the second, and then you need to be very generous with the chair later. No. Yeah. Well, yeah. No, you haven't lit your hair on fire yet. Okay, before this degenerates, I'm calling the meeting to order. And I just want to, on behalf of the committee, welcome our guests. And I appreciate your cooperation in trying to merge 2 hours into one panel, which I think is actually a more useful way to go about things. And I'm still going to go in the order of the expected appearance. And I'm going to ask each of you for a 5-minute opening statement. Our first witness is Greg Carreau, Director General, Safe Environments Directorate. Thank you, Mr. Carreau, for joining us. And then our second witness will be Seth Kane, Director of Contaminated Sites Division at Environment and Climate Change Canada. And our third witness will be from the Treasury Board Secretariat, Sarah Evans, Executive Director, Investment Management Director. And this is all pursuant to Standing Order 1082, where we adopted a motion that the committee commence its study in the Department of Defense, National Defense Canadian Forces contaminated sites. So this is our first meeting, and I look forward to what you have to say. I'll start with Mr. Carreau. 5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Honourable members of the committee, I would like to thank you for inviting me to talk about the expertise that Health Canada provides to assist the Department of National Defence in addressing contaminated sites. It's my pleasure to join you today on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. I'm speaking on behalf of Health Canada in my role as Director General of the Safe Environments Directorate in the Healthy Environments and Consumer Safety Branch.
Increase of chemical substances introduced into the chemicals market that yielded tremendous benefits, including firefighting foams. However, many chemicals also introduced risks to human health and the environment. Health Canada works to protect people in Canada from chemicals risks in a number of ways. Le plan d'action pour les sites contaminés fédéraux dans le
Of most immediate relevance to this committee is the Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plan, through which Health Canada assists a number of federal organizations responsible for contaminated sites, including the Department of National Defence. When requested, Health Canada scientists provide technical advice on site-specific health risk assessments and have developed guidance for assessing and addressing health risks of chemicals associated with historical military activities such as per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS, trichloroethylene, TCEs, dioxins, and energetic compounds.
19 technical guidance documents on methods to support the assessments of risks to health from chemicals in soil, air, water, country foods, and others at contaminated sites. Furthermore, Health Canada supports guidance with training for federal organizations responsible for contaminated sites, including the Department of Defence. Another way in which Health Canada works to protect people in Canada from chemicals risks is through administering parts of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, or CEPA, in collaboration with Environment and Climate Change Canada. Recent amendments to CEPA have strengthened Canada's management of chemicals to protect human health and the environment. For the first time in federal legislation, it is recognized that every individual in Canada has a right to a healthy environment. Changes to CEPA also introduced a transparent priority setting plan for addressing chemicals and a watch list of substances of potential concern, and reinforced the need to protect our most susceptible populations. Dans le cadre du plan de gestion de produits chimiques, les scientifiques de
Within the Chemicals Management Plan, Health Canada scientists identify how people in Canada are exposed to chemicals, the risks they pose, and the actions that can be taken to address risks to human health. A major priority for the Government of Canada is the assessment and management of risks related to PFASs, commonly referred to as forever chemicals. For over 15 years now, Health Canada has been taking action on this group of substances, which has many important uses, including firefighting foams.
Reported for a small number of well-studied PFAS, including but not limited to liver, kidney, thyroid, and nervous systems. There's also an increasing amount of new science that shows that other PFAS can also lead to similar negative health effects. With the objective of replacing PFAS with safer alternatives, Canada is amongst the leaders in the global community to assess and manage over 4,700 PFAS as a single class of substances. In summary, Health Canada works to support the protection of people in Canada from risks associated with chemicals. An important aspect of this work is assisting the Department of National Defence in addressing contaminated sites associated with historical military activities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Curro. Mr. Kane, 5 minutes, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Seth Kane, and I am the Director of the Contaminated Sites Division within the Environmental Protection and Operations Directorate of Environment and Climate Change Canada. I oversee the Secretariat of the Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plan, which we refer to as FCSAP. This program helps the federal government to address its contaminated sites, and I am here today to respond to your questions about the FCSAP approach. FCSAP was established in 2005 as a 15-year program. In 2019, it was renewed for another 15 years, with Budget 2019 providing funding for the first 5 years of this renewed period, and it has been funded again through Budget 2024. The objective of FCSAP is to reduce environmental and human health risks from federal contaminated sites and to reduce the associated liabilities to the Government of Canada. FCSAP provides funding, guidance, and expert support for the cleanup of federal contaminated sites across the country. The program funds federal organizations such as the Department of National Defence to undertake assessment, remediation, and risk management activities at their federal contaminated sites. A federal organization which manages a contaminated site is referred to as a custodian. Environment and Climate Change Canada has 3 roles in this program. First, through the Secretariat, we provide administrative, policy, and reporting leadership. Secondly, as an expert support department like Health Canada, we provide guidance, training, and scientific advice regarding ecological risks. And thirdly, as a custodian, Environment Canada is responsible for the management of its own contaminated sites. I thank you and look forward to responding to your questions.
And finally, Ms. Evans, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank the committee for inviting us to support its study of the Department of National Defence and Canadian Armed Forces' contaminated sites. My name is Sarah Evans, and I am the Executive Director of Investment Management within the Office of the Comptroller General at the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat. I would like to take a moment to outline the role that the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat plays in supporting the management of federal contaminated sites. First, the Treasury Board sets the administrative policy framework for the management of federal real property through the Directive on the Management of Real Property. The directive outlines the responsibilities of departments that administer real property, which we call custodian organizations, so that the real property is planned, acquired, used, and disposed of in a manner that supports the delivery of programs and services to Canadians while ensuring best value for the Crown. As part of the directive, the responsibilities of each custodian organization that manages contaminated sites is set out. This includes following standards and guidelines endorsed by the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment. Deuxièmement, par souci de transparence, les organisations gardiennes qui administrent des sites contaminés.
Second, in support of transparency, custodian organizations. Can you hear the interpreter? Can you hear the interpretation? Can you hear the interpretation? Sure. Second, in support of transparency, custodian organizations that administer contaminated sites must also report annually on them in the Federal Contaminated Sites Inventory. Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat is responsible for the administration of this publicly available information system. The reporting requirements for the inventory are set out in the directive and are established by the Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plan governance. Custodian organizations submit information on their contaminated sites and certify to the completeness and accuracy of that data. The Federal Contaminated Sites Inventory includes data on all known and suspected contaminated sites under the custodianship of federal departments, agencies, and consolidated crown corporations. It displays a standard set of baseline and annually updated information for federal contaminated sites and provides points of contact so that Canadians can request additional information regarding specific contaminated sites. As science continues to evolve related to contaminants of emerging concern, the Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plan Secretariat, led by my colleagues at Environment and Climate Change Canada, works with relevant regulators, such as Health Canada, to establish reporting requirements. As of 2024-25, the Federal Contaminated Sites Inventory will include information on per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances contamination for active contaminated sites.
Administration of the Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plan. As my colleague has outlined in their opening remarks, the Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plan is the main government program to address federal contaminated sites. We support Environment and Climate Change Canada in their secretariat role to manage horizontal elements of the program. This is primarily through the management of the Federal Contaminated Sites Inventory, as well as supporting the governance committees for the initiative. With that, Mr. Chair, I am pleased to answer any questions from committee members about Treasury Board and Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat's roles with respect to the management of contaminated sites.
Thank you. Mr. Tolmie, welcome to the committee. 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for having me here, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. I have a couple of questions, and obviously the relevance for me is very important, having two bases in my riding, and so some of the things that you have shared are very, very important. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions with regards, and I think, Mr. Kane, I'm going to ask you first because you mentioned a Fix app. And just for the record, is there a reporting requirement or a hierarchy and a chain of command for people, departments, to record contaminated sites?
Thank you for the question. So there are a set of guidelines first about reporting publicly through the Federal Contaminated Sites Inventory, which Ms. Evans mentioned in her opening remarks and can elaborate on. That is, through that inventory, we ensure and custodians are responsible for providing basic information about contaminated sites. That inventory also provides points of contacts for a member of the public to be able to contact a specific site owner, such as D&D or any other federal department or agency, to request additional information on a given site.
Okay. So then my question would be, if you are not aware of having a contaminated site on your base or in your area, how would you know? How would you find out that there is a contaminated site? Or could this just be not missed because we don't have people that are properly trained for identifying contaminated sites?
So thank you for the question again. The federal contaminated sites inventory is public, and so is available through that channel. I think it's also important to note that a given custodian of a contaminated site, it's their responsibility to be aware of and to communicate appropriately if there are risks to, human health, and would that be that the broader public or employees?
Okay, so I'll ask the same question, but in just a slightly different way. If I were a base commander, or a wing commander, or a unit commander, and I didn't know that there was contamination in the area that I'm working, that would go unnoticed unless someone has that expertise and recognizes that they're dealing with or working with contamination. So if you don't know, how would you be able to report that? If you don't know what you're working with, how do you find out? I mean, the reporting system is based on knowing and identifying what contaminated sites are.
I'll offer just
And
maybe
it can go to anybody.
I'll offer one additional piece of insight on that, which is the Federal Contaminates Action Plan, which has been in place since 2005, has led to, especially in its early years, a comprehensive effort on the part of federal departments, agencies, real property landowners to identify potentially contaminated sites. We refer to them as suspected. And then the process is to work through those potential sites to understand whether there is in fact contamination, whether it exceeds guidelines, and then to work through planning and cleaning up those sites. And so there's been a pretty comprehensive effort going back many years to identify potential sites. And it's not to say that there aren't any uncertainties left, but it's been pretty comprehensive. And as an example, the program, when it started, was estimating in the range of 6,000 contaminated sites. It's now over 24,000, with the large majority of those now closed, over 18,000, and in many cases closed once it was determined that a site was not in fact contaminated, so it was purely suspected.
Okay, thank you, and I appreciate that. I want to have that on the record. My concern is that we're working with numerous departments, and that they're siloed, and that there is where's the chain of command, where's the hierarchy, and what is the obligation if you notice a contaminated site. And so how much time do I have? I have 30 seconds. I have 30 seconds. Never enough time. Yeah. Okay. Again, I just want to say thank you, and I am concerned that members of the military might not understand what they're dealing with, and I want to make sure that there is a chain of command and that there is a hierarchy for answering to someone. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Cholmy. Just for the chair's edification, what's your riding and what are the bases that are in the riding?
So it's Moose Jaw Lake Center, Lanigan, and it is 15 wing, where the snowbirds, we lend them out to the rest of Canada, and Dundurn, obviously, it's a site where we have a lot of old weapons that we get rid of. Thank you.
So, thank you. I have either Mr. Pawlowski or, Madame Lambropoulos. 6 minutes, please.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here with us to answer some questions on this important topic today. I guess my first question is for environment and climate change, and I'm wondering if you can let us know what the process is when someone does, when the department does receive feedback that there is a contaminated site, what happens at that point?
Thank you for the question. So we have set out as a community really a 10-step process that federal real property holders follow. We refer to it as the decision-making framework. The 10 steps start with identifying a potential or suspected contaminated site. It proceeds through different sort of degrees and levels of evaluation. including sampling, looking and comparing site results against guidelines, and then leading to confirmation that it is in fact contaminated. At which point a plan will be developed to remediate or put in place risk management measures for a given site. That will be implemented. There'll be confirmatory sampling or long-term monitoring, and then closure of a site. So that's the broad strokes of how a site is managed from start to finish.
Okay, thank you. And I guess we've heard also that it could spill over into communities sometimes, and I'm wondering what the process is at that point if a community has let you know that there's been that there's contaminated water or whatever it might be.
So thank you for the question. That does occur, and it is certainly part of the responsibilities of those individual site owners, D&D or any other, to understand whether the contamination may have traveled off-site, to inform landowners, stakeholders, as required, the public or Indigenous peoples, and then to, conduct the sort of testing that's needed to confirm the sort of risk and contaminants that are present, and then to assess those like they would on federal lands. So that's the basics. Always important to work with landowners and to consider not just federal guidelines, but also possibly provincial guidelines in the case where the contamination has gone off of federal lands.
Thank you. Mr. Caro, you mentioned that there are several things that Health Canada does in order to protect Canadians from these contaminants, these chemicals, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what can be added to these measures to better protect Canadians.
Thank you very much for the question. So, indeed, Health Canada plays an important role in supporting custodians in remediating and identifying contaminated sites by way of leveraging its science-based programs, whether they be air pollution, drinking water, chemicals, or foods. Guidelines and advice and technical input is provided to custodians so that they are well aware of the levels of risk that may be present from exposures at contaminated sites and what levels would be considered, levels that would reduce that risk over time. So, leveraging that very robust science-based program at Health Canada, I think we're fully confident that the advice and guidance we provide to custodians does reflect consistent and tangible guidance that is reflective of current science on the health effects of these pollutants.
Okay. You also mentioned, I guess, you lightly touched on the negative health effects. You said that it affects liver, kidney, nervous systems, and can you go a little bit more into like the worst case scenario of what the effect would be on health?
Thanks very much for the question. So the range of pollutants that may be present at contaminated sites are highly variable, obviously, depending on what chemicals, what pollutants, what exposure scenarios may be present, whether or not they may be disproportionately impacted people on the sites, like toddlers at playgrounds or pregnant people in the environment. And so it's difficult to answer that in a very succinct question, but I would say that many of these chemicals can lead to increased risks of cancer over time, and that's why it's important that the health-based input that's provided is underpinning the actions that custodians are taking on these contaminated sites.
Okay. Thank you. And then I know that there are different types of PFAS. Is that how you say that? Okay. And which ones are the ones that are most often found, contaminating these sites, and which ones are used on these bases?
Thanks again for the question. So I think as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that class of perfluorinated alkyl substances, or PFAS, is upwards of 5,000, maybe 10,000 group of chemicals internationally. In the context of contaminated sites, they're predominantly from legacy use of aqueous film-forming foams that are present either for the use of containing fires or for training purposes. The Government of Canada has been looking at this class of chemicals for over 15 years. There's very well characterized chemicals, including PFOS, long-chain perfluorine octane sulfate, also a range of other very complex chemicals. But well-studied chemicals, Health Canada has recently adopted a drinking water quality objective, which cites the most common PFAS that are being monitored at these contaminated sites, and then provides guidance on analytical methods to ensure that sampling is done to detect these chemicals, what treatment can be done, both at the domestic, residential scale.
The answer there. Ms. Lambropoulos is out of time. 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît, Madame.
6 minutes, Ms. Normandin. Thank you very much. Thanks to all of our witnesses for appearing today. My first question is for Mr. Kane, perhaps Mr. Caro. I would like to piggyback on the questions asked by Mr. Tolmie. You're saying that, first of all, you have to be able to identify the contaminant at a contaminated site. Very often you use a product and you don't know that it was a contaminant. I was wondering if there is an obligation to give you access to all of the products that could be used on a site, on any given site, all of the chemical products that could be used, like a registry that would allow you to go and determine that a site is contaminated. It's kind of like an aftermarket process for products. You can recall them. Is that possible to do that for the management of contaminated sites?
I am not aware of a registry of that type. The community has been working together for many years and has identified a list of chemicals that are part of the federal contaminated sites inventory, and so it is an obligation on the part of custodians, the real property owners, to be aware of those hazards, those chemicals, and to consider if they may have been used at their sites, leading to, in the case of a potential or suspected contaminated site, to then make that information public on the inventory. So I think that's probably the most direct answer that I can provide on that question.
Oui. OK. À ce moment-là, est-ce que ce serait utile que...
In that case, would it be useful to have a list of all of the sites that could become contaminated, maintain a list, even if those products are not considered contaminated, so that once they are considered contaminants, then it would be easier to identify the contaminated site? Is that a possibility?
I can add from a health perspective, as you rightly pointed out, science does evolve over time, and new health and environmental risks can be identified for chemicals. Oftentimes, Health Canada will develop new standards based on that new science, and that is made available to custodians as a basis to then identify new risks that may be present with their custodians. So I think that linkage between emerging science, emerging risks, and custodians to identify what risks may be in those areas as well, that will identified.
Justement, bon...
Indeed, this might be a question from you, Mr. Caro. You're responsible to identifying the levels of toxicity for some products, but very often products will end up leaving a site that will find themselves on non-federal property. What would happen in a context where the federal standards are different from provincial standards? For example, the Quebec government has one standard and the federal government has another one. So you can have one site that would have different standards applied to it. So how would that work? Thanks very much for the question.
Base of environmental health and some of these health contaminants, there is jurisdiction from the province and territories that applies in certain contaminated sites. In those instances, there's a very close collaboration between the federal government and the province to collaborate on advice and guidance that is provided to custodian. Ultimately, if the contamination and the issue is on provincial space, provincial jurisdiction, it would be the provincial authority that would be guiding and providing their advice and guidance to custodians. The federal government would be very close collaborator in providing support as necessary.
Merci. J'aimerais vous entendre sur le principe de...
I would like to hear you talk about the precautionary principle. If we don't yet know the level of toxicity of a product, is there a precautionary principle whereby even if the level hasn't been reached for toxicity, there's still measures taken to make sure that the populace won't be affected by a contaminant?
Pour la question,
Thanks for the question.
the precautionary principle features prominently in all the activities that Health Canada does to identify the level of risks related to a certain product or a chemical. It is entrenched in the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. As I mentioned, that is the basis for many of Health Canada's legislative programs. We've also introduced through our risk assessments uncertainty factors that allow for uncertainty and precaution when Health Canada does come up with a toxicity value. And a good example of precaution is the PFAS example where I just spoke to, where the Government of Canada had been looking at a chemical by chemical approach, recognized the large chemicals nature and the drinking water objective brings together that broad class, using precaution as a basis to protect Canadians from exposure to PFAS in drinking water.
Ms. Normandy. Matheson, 5 minutes, please. Six, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to the witnesses today. This is an important study. I wanted to ask, first off, there was a lot of conversation about the PFAS, but could you talk about the health risks of TCE and hydrocarbons? I think that might help Canada, maybe.
Thank you very much for the question. Appreciate it. Yes, indeed, TC is a well-studied chemical solvent that can cause cancer. As you may know, it's been used for many decades, primarily for automotive metal industries, degreasing and cleaning metal parts. Through the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, there was regulations put in place to reduce exposure to Canadians and the environment. It is noted that people living in close proximity to contaminated sites may be exposed to TCE in drinking water, as well as through air, water, and food.
Okay. But that's part of this fix-up as well.
Correct. So Health Canada does have guidance both in indoor air quality standards, in drinking water standards that is characterized to health risks from exposure to TCE through those various exposure pathways, and those guidance are used as a basis for custodians to manage established contaminated sites. And
as we explore more and more, there's conversations about needing to expand on housing and the investigations of maybe using federal lands like D&D lands for the expansion of that, selling off that property, using it for housing, or even just building housing around those areas which exist in my riding as per se. There was a conversation, I think Ms. Lambropoulos asked, if the community found out about it because of contamination, because there was water sampling or what have you, then they would approach Health Canada, and it is for the holder of the land, right, the guardian of that land or whatever. So D&D for this example, to actively inform and proactively inform the community. Correct? It's not just a one way; it has to happen both ways.
Correct.
and you had talked about those lands that weren't federal, but there certainly is an impact. I mean, water runs beneath. There are impacts that expand past those boundaries, water or soil contamination or whatever. They don't just exist, to the boundary. So who's responsible for the cost of the cleanup on those, say, like a provincial land, if it's seeping out elsewhere?
Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plan is normally able to fund the cleanup when the contamination has started on federal lands or as a result of, federal activities, and is considered a federal contaminated site.
So those other jurisdictions would have to go after that money, or would it be more proactively provided?
Once the contamination has been identified, it's proactive. It is up for the custodian of that site, a D&D or whomever, to understand, communicate with an adjacent landowner, and then work to sample and determine a path forward. Working with a provincial regulator, as Greg mentioned, or otherwise, and then FICSAP is able to fund that work to a D&D or other land custodian.
I think, Mr. Carroll, can you clarify what role Health Canada has in the testing and assessment of the human health risks on D&D properties? Is your team at any point involved in the analyzing of test results or providing guidance on interpreting those health impacts?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So we do provide guidance to custodians, including D&D, on how to sample, where to sample, what analytical methods should be used to ensure rigorous testing is done to establish levels of concern in those areas. We also provide guidance on interpreting the results that come back, comparing them to levels of concerns that we've identified. In the case of drinking water, we'd advise on what treatment could be implemented, both at the domestic and at the community-wide, to address those concerns. So very much hand in hand with custodians on making sure that testing is done in a scientific, rigorous way, and then very much providing guidance and support on interpreting those results.
Very much, I think, to Mr. Tolmie's point, you're providing guidance, you are not the ultimate authority.
Correct.
Okay. In conducting the work on identifying and assessing those contamination sites on federal lands, what expertise is required? So what type of an amount of experts would you have expected to be involved in that ground level investigating?
I'll start, if I may. Thank you for the question. It very much will depend on the nature of the site. Sites can range from quite simple, say, petroleum hydrocarbon spill to limited extent, and so it's relatively straightforward for contaminated sites experts available in the private sector, or even within a larger department where they have a fair number of staff with science expert backgrounds. In other cases, it can be a highly complex mixture of chemicals that has the risks of spread and really needs to the benefit of engaging with experts at Environment Canada or Health Canada to be able to determine the risks and an appropriate path forward.
Ms. Gallant, 5 minutes.
Thank you. So there had been previous reports of military disposal on ACL land adjacent to Base Petawawa. Previously, the Standing Committee talked about this, but they didn't get any answers. There were reports of biological warfare containers of nerve gas, mustard gas, anthrax, and other unknown agents that were buried in the waste disposal site for the low-level waste that was buried on ACL property. I would like to know, is there an inventory of what the military buried there? And the reason I ask is they are about to exhume that soil and clean it and put it in a near-surface waste disposal facility to contain it. So it would be helpful for the people who are on the ground or operating a backhoe to know that if they come across a barrel with their scoop, not to puncture a barrel that might have nerve gas or anthrax in it. So is there an inventory?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. So we do have the Federal Contaminated Sites Inventory, which is everything that custodians across the country have identified. In terms of the specifics for that specific site, my best advice would be when D&D officials come to ask them specifically about that site and what detailed information they have available. Because as my colleagues indicated, it's certainly within the accountability of the Department of National Defense that they would be tracking all of that sort of information.
Okay, we have asked that question and they didn't know or just wouldn't tell, so I hope they tell you. Last week, Minister Blair came to this committee and claimed that the Treasury Board had made a decision to exempt the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces from the second round of spending cuts. Is this accurate?
So
Well, it is because we're talking money, and this project is going to cost money.
Well, insofar as you can answer the question, go ahead, but go ahead.
my apologies to the honourable member, Mr. Chair. I'm not involved in that specific exercise, so I'm not familiar with the details of it.
Okay, would you ask the people at Treasury Secretariat, Treasury Board Secretariat, who would know the answer to that, to provide us with the documentation so we would be able to verify what the minister told us is true? Okay, so Treasury Board Secretariat. Okay.
Just
can we request?
well,
do you need
you
a
can
motion?
request it, but you need to request it of people who can actually deliver.
I know she can't deliver it, but would she take that request to the people at Treasury Board Secretariat so that we can get the verification?
Presumably could transport the request. Whether she gets the answer is another issue.
Maybe somebody from Treasury Board Secretariat's watching, and they'll get the question. So,
It's a very loose undertaking, shall we say.
and Treasury Board Secretariat's also responsible for overall for government cybersecurity. What is the mechanism by which the Center for Cybersecurity contacts the House of Commons when there is a widespread cyber attack going on?
Not quite sure I see the connection here, but if somebody has an answer to Ms. Gallant's inquiry, we're all ears.
My apologies again, Mr. Chair. I'm not familiar with the cybersecurity. That would fall under the Chief Information Officer.
So do we know that the money is in place to carry out these very important environmental remediations on military property? Because what we received in the supplementary estimates was an indication that there was going to be a $2.7 billion cut to military spending. And what you're doing is very important, so I want to ensure that the money is going to be there to carry out your full mission.
Again, I'm not quite sure how this panel of witnesses would respond to a question such as that, but you are more than welcome to try and respond to Ms. Gallant's question.
So there was an announcement in the most recent budget about the renewal of the Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plan program, and we're working closely with our colleagues in Environment and Climate Change Canada, as well as all custodians, to be able to move forward with implementing what was announced in the most recent budget.
And Mr. Fraser told me was going to continue on.
I wish I could have merged those with the other 30 seconds I had before. Just following up, so the comment was made that the military, the DND, is not obligated or does not fall under the Treasury Board or any other department to disclose or inform you of contaminated sites. Is that correct? Is that my understanding?
We have the Federal Contaminated Sites Inventory.
Yes.
So the Federal Contaminated Sites Inventory was launched in 2002. All federal custodians, including the Department of National Defense, are required to report annually in regards to all of their suspected or confirmed contaminated sites within the Federal Contaminated Sites Inventory.
Mr. Pelosi, 5 minutes.
My colleague, Ms. Gallant, suggested in contaminated sites there'd be a concern of barrels of anthrax. Did Canada ever use biological weapons or manufacture them or store them, to your knowledge?
None of us would have that type of knowledge or expertise.
Would that be something that would be considered confidential?
Mr. Chair, I would question that. I would defer to national defense, I think, to respond to.
I guess the question for Mr. Carreau would be, even if it was, I mean, even if we had such things in the 50s, 70 years later, is that still going to be biologically active? Is there any legitimate concern about biological contaminations like that?
I'm not quite sure you feel comfortable answering that question, but you're more than welcome to do so.
Question. I wouldn't be able to answer that question.
Switch over to PFAS, which I guess is what we're here to talk about. Which military sites, former or existing, have we found high levels of PFAS? And where is it? In the water, the groundwater, the surface water?
Thanks for the question. So as my colleague, Ms. Evans, noted, the Federal Contaminated Sites Inventory does list a number of contaminated sites across the country, including those that may contain PFAS. There's upwards of approximately 100 contaminated sites across the country that contain some levels of contamination on PFAS. Those levels, the contamination would largely be soil and groundwater.
Are the sites primarily sites which used to be or still are air bases? Because my understanding is the concern was it was primarily coming from the foam that firefighters use to fight fires. So is it just at those sites, or is it at other sites too?
I can't speak for, custodians would be best placed to be able to identify where all their sites are and what activities led to that contamination. We are quite right, honourable member, that the contamination was resulting from mostly aqueous film-forming foams that would have been applied either to extinguish fires or to train firefighters in how to use those foams. The repeat application, those would be at military applications or airports or other installations that would have had those activities.
Now, how do we know that the source of contamination was the military? Because I looked up an article published in the New York Times, which cited a Nature Geoscience magazine where I guess it was, it combined a whole bunch of studies, 45,000 water samples from around the world. They found 31% of groundwater not near sources of contamination had harmful levels of PFAS in them, and the levels were based on the Environmental Protection Agency, U.S. Levels. So, and 16% of surface water. So it seems like it's fairly ubiquitous, even around places where you don't have obvious sources of contamination. So, okay, you find it a place, how do you know it was the military that caused it? Or do we not know that, or do we assume that?
Thanks for the question. So you're quite right, honourable member, that PFAS is being found and detected around the globe, including across Canada, as far as remote areas and northern communities. I'll defer to the Department of National Defence in terms of how they've attributed their plume and their activities as a source of the contamination on certain areas, but I have full confidence that is done in a very rigorous and scientific way.
So have we admitted responsibility when there is a high level, or is that a point of contention as to the causality as to who caused this?
It will depend on specific sites and the circumstances, but as with other contaminants, be they petroleum hydrocarbons, there is this sort of hydrogeology to be able to model and predict how these types of contaminants enter the soil and then move through soil and groundwater. And so there's, while PFAS has its own unique characteristics, there's a very strong scientific basis to be able to sample, test, and predict how these things move through the environment, and that's the type of thing that Environment Canada supports D&D and others with, and D&D will be able to speak to specific sites if you have questions.
He's done. Yeah. 5 minutes, Madame Normandin.
Merci beaucoup. Peut-être des questions.
Thank you. My questions today will be for Ms. Evans and Mr. Keynes. You talked about the cost to decontaminate the sites. You already have a budget for that. Perhaps you could tell me about how that budget is used. But also, sometimes you have to go off-site to do the decontamination. Sometimes there are people who want to get some indemnity, some compensation, because they would have been victims of contamination. So how do you set the parameters? Is it done on a case-by-case basis? How do you discuss this with the Treasury Board if you have to go beyond the amount set? So what happens at the time that you do have to do the decontamination, but then what happens once you have to compensate the people?
So underpinning FIXAP and the work that each of the custodians do are the guidelines established by the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment. And those guidelines are designed to be protective of human health and the environment. And so those very much guide the work that each custodian does on its sites, including in cases where the contamination has left a site. Custodians apply those guidelines in a way that is representative of the type of land use that's intended to occur there in the future. So cleaning a site to the use of a future industrial purpose is different than cleaning it to residential use, for example. And so these types of things apply as custodians are designing their remediation and risk management plans. I think when we go into space like indemnification, that's an area where it's very much a question that we would work through on a case-by-case with Department of Justice and the specific custodian. So I hesitate to speak in generalities about that topic area.
Peut-être une sous-question à ce moment.
Perhaps an additional question? You explained how decontamination works. With regard to mitigation measures, in the case of Bagotville, for example, it wasn't a case of decontamination, but there was a question of water filtration systems by the municipality. That kind of goes beyond the scope of decontamination. Are there any parameters for that type of situation?
Thank you for the question. And maybe it's worth spending just a moment to differentiate between remediation and risk management. So remediation as a concept is about removing or completely addressing the contamination away. For example, maybe filtering it out of water that's on the site to be able to remove it permanently. Whereas risk mitigation tends to be such things as maybe putting in physical barriers so people cannot access a contaminated site. It could include capping a site so that rainwater is unable to penetrate and then push the contaminants into groundwater. Another type of risk mitigation can be breaking the pathway between the contaminant and a human or an animal. And so water filtration is a valid approach that is used and is the situation in the city of Saguenay that you referenced. So I guess not sure if I've covered all elements of your question, but hopefully.
Les barèmes monétaires.
What about the monetary parameters for those types of situations? Have they already been set?
That type of scenario, so I'm unable to speak to it. In the case of Saguenay, the federal government has contributed funding and is paying most of the costs for the city to be able to add and operate water filtration. And so I guess I would point to that as the situation for that community.
J'aimerais savoir, est-ce qu'à un moment...
At any point, either from your side or from Treasury Board, has there been a consultation of any sort, perhaps a legal consultation due to lawsuits? At what point do you communicate if there is a contentious issue? Well, there is that type of work being done by Treasury Board. Generally, we work very closely with experts. As my colleague said, there may be a few people who work for the Justice Department or something like that, but I'm not really familiar with any consultations on that topic.
Okay. I'd like to just go back. We were talking about the guidance that's provided, not the authority on issues. How often does D&D ask for guidance from Health Canada, from Environment Canada, to come in and help with that testing and those assessments? How often has that been done?
So I can start. I know Environment and Climate Change Canada is also an expert department that receives many calls for advice. So I would say it's routine, ongoing, irregular in terms of the advice and guidance that's sought from Department of National Defence. That will range from a help in delineating potential contamination or setting a priority level of how high a priority should be on a contaminated sites, how do the risk assessments analysis, what is the level of risk of the current concentration of contaminated sites, what are treatment or mitigation measures, and then following, we also support engagement. So going to communities and other areas to help communicate what the risks are from a human health perspective to communities. So very regular, very collaborative and ongoing, I would characterize it.
So like a monthly thing?
Yeah, I think it's highly variable depending on the situation, but
Okay.
I would echo the remarks. I don't have specific data about how often it is that D&D reaches out to Environment Canada on specific sites, so I would have to request that. Certainly regularly, but I'd have to ask for data.
So in terms of, I'm a little bit concerned from what we've heard from others, not today, but from others, about the lack of monitoring or the auditing of the process. So if Health Canada, for example, is concerned that there's a human health impact, or there's human health impact assessments that are mismanaged, say, on a particular site, do you have the option to take that over to then access the test results? Do you have the option to access the site to conduct any independent tests? Like if there's complaints from the public, right, that would go through you
Right.
as opposed to concerns, how would that be managed?
yeah, certainly. I mean, there's no proactive role for Health Canada that would proactively go and assess, as you've mentioned. However, if there's requests from the public or others, certainly that would be a conversation we would have with the Department of National Defence to see what help and guidance we could provide.
Because in terms of that, and I think Mr. Tomey was trying to get to this too, right, in terms of that chain of command, like the custodian, I think is what the term is, the custodian is the ultimate authority. So is there no role, if there's a concern from Health Canada or Environment Canada, is there no way to override or to enforce that the rulings upon another custodian?
It can be difficult to speak in hypotheticals, but I think what I would, how I would respond is to say that, if Environment Canada or Health Canada, I think I can safely say, is made aware of a particular case and D&D is, or any custodian is in need of some supporting detailed analysis, that is possible for us to do. And to review the conclusions, and so I think we would discuss it with D&D or any given custodian, and then assess the science if that was required. And I guess I would point to the accountabilities of each custodian, which we've mentioned, and also the professional obligations of the staff and the consultants that work for them to to meet their sort of ethical and professional requirements.
But ultimately, in terms of this idea, and we've often heard in terms of like silos within departments, if say the Environment Canada has these concerns and it goes up their totem pole, I guess, is there ever any, because those poles are equal, because is there an auditing process? Is there an assessment of who ultimately at the end of the day wins for the best case scenario of public health?
So if I may, Mr. Chair, so there are several lines of defense. So as my colleagues indicated, it starts at a project level with the experts on the ground who are working on a specific project. There's then a program layer, which is led by my colleagues in Environment and Climate Change Canada. And part of that is, yes, primarily in terms of sharing lessons learned, best practices, but there's also governance there. And then we get to sort of our auditing layer, so our third-party experts, which, if I understand your question, is what you're looking at. So within National Defence, they do have their own internal audit function, which is third-party, but there's also roles for other third-party auditors, such as the Office of the Auditor General. There's the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development, who does audits. They've done a number of audits related to contaminated sites. There was one that just came out recently in the spring. There's also a number of legal requirements stemming from different pieces of legislation.
Okay, we're going to have to
Oh, my
leave it there. Ms. Mattson is well over her time. Mr. Stewart, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I think this is a question for you, Ms. Evans. What proportion of all the federally, all the sites that are listed on this inventory are managed by CAF or D&D?
So my apologies, Mr. Chair. I do have that data. So I will find the specific number for the member. My apologies. But in total, there are about 24,000 sites within the federal contaminated sites inventory. About 18,000, of those are closed, and about 6,000 are still active. I have the figures, so if I can't find it quickly for you, I will get back to you with those specific figures of how many of those are D&D sites.
We have, you have the number? Yeah,
At my
sure.
fingertips. Just
Oh,
had a
perfect.
chance to search while Sarah spoke. So D&D has 1,947 contaminated sites listed in the inventory, and of those, 1,200 are closed, 627 are active, and then 119 are suspected. And that's data active or accurate to the end of last fiscal year.
That's around 700 of the 7,000. That around 10% are D&D sites then, of the total, roughly?
That's correct. So about 750 of the 6,000 active sites are
Okay,
D&D.
so a little bit higher than 12% or something like that. Okay. And then are there new chemicals that are being added to the list of contaminants from time to time?
Yes.
Okay.
We recently added to the federal contaminated sites inventory PFAS, as my colleague spoke about. So in terms of what we report through the inventory, we work closely with the expert departments to determine what additional chemicals should be added.
So
to
that
the
number,
inventory.
that's 627, was that like 400, and then PFAS gets added? So, oh my goodness, all these new sites need to be added?
So my understanding is it's on existing sites. So
Okay.
on existing sites, we've now identified additional chemicals, but it can happen that sites could be closed and then reopened because additional chemicals are identified.
Significant difference between per and polyfluoroalkyl substances?
Sorry, excuse me. Thank you for the question. It's a class of all perfluorinated compounds, which are, in essence, we treat as a class, recognizing they all have similar uses, similar health and environmental concerns.
So when it comes to remediation for PFAS or things like TCE, are the techniques roughly the same? Like if it's a soil contamination, you dig the soil up, put a liner in, put it through a machine, clean it, and then put it back, whether it's PCE or PFAS?
I speak from a drinking water perspective. Treatment is very unique to the chemical and the contaminant, how it behaves. So a treatment for perfluorinated compounds would not necessarily be the exact same treatment for other chemicals.
I mean, like in aggregate, we're going to pump the water, we're going to treat it, and we're going to put it back, or with a specific routine of decontamination specific to the chemical. Is that kind of like the macro way it's done? Is that the same, or is it completely different?
So there are common approaches used. For example, removing contaminated soil from the site and taking it to a certified disposal facility where it can be treated. Another technique that's commonly used is putting pumping, cleaning, and returning groundwater, and working it through filters as part of that process. There can be various barriers and things that are put up to allow for treatment as well. So there's a mixture, but there are common ones that get used. As to whether they work specifically in a context can be very, site-specific.
And that there was any, at the time, proper disposal into a disposal area, but it turns out that the disposal techniques, there was a proper line. What they thought at the time was a proper kind of liner for contaminated disposal site, and they just failed because the engineering perhaps wasn't what it maybe should have been at the time.
Thank you for the question. The quality of the science and the information that we have certainly evolves, and so there are circumstances where a site managed and treated in one fashion is proved to be inadequate in the long term. One of the situations where that is occurring these days is in relation to climate change, where certain types of, say, risk mitigation measures put in place, like capping or relying on the permafrost layer to keep contaminants in place, are changing in ways that we couldn't have predicted a few decades ago. So I think the short answer is yes, and then it would be a site-specific example if you have any questions.
Mr. Collins, 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our witnesses. Way back when I was first elected in 1995, the City of Hamilton took ownership of Transport Canada lands around the John C. Munro Airport. And it wasn't until about 2011 that we found off-site migration of PFAS materials on neighboring properties. And we traced it back to a firefighter training facility on airport lands. And I have to tell you that from my experience, it was not an enjoyable process to deal with either the former government or the current government in terms of receiving compensation for the contaminants that were found. In the end, government officials paid for the off-site cleanup on lands that surrounded the airport, but the private operator that operated the airport on the municipality's behalf was stuck with the bill to pay for the contaminants that were found on the airport property. And so I'm thinking of a scenario right now where our affordable housing strategy and national housing strategy are going to use defense lands and transfer those properties to nonprofit service providers. From a municipal perspective, we had enough resources to deal with the federal lawyers and all of the ministry officials to defend our rights as landowners and seek compensation. I can't imagine a scenario where a nonprofit housing provider would have the same types of resources if they found contaminants on their properties years later. And so I'm trying to find a way. Well, I'd like to ask you the question in terms of the current scenario. If I use the example in Hamilton, and I've given you the bare bones version of what happened, it certainly left a bad taste in our ratepayers' mouths, and municipal council certainly could have some very colorful language to use in terms of how we dealt with that situation. How do we avoid those scenarios in terms of knowing that nonprofit housing providers are going to use former defense lands? If they find surprises in the future, they don't have deep pockets. And I'm looking for recommendations from you to provide to the committee so that we can prove the legislation that we have right now and ensure that this doesn't happen to someone who doesn't have the resources to fight the federal government.
Mr. Chair. So certainly within the directive on the management of real property, whenever a site's being disposed, it's required that custodians are transparent about whatever information they have. In terms of following up, in terms of legal liability for something that may be discovered years down the line, that was something that would have to be specified within the agreement in terms of the sale of the property, but it certainly is a requirement that the department would have to be clear and upfront with whatever information that's known at the time.
A couple of times during your testimony, you mentioned that these sites have been, or they were used and abused decades ago. And so the records, and I'll use the Hamilton Airport scenario as an example, the records just don't exist in terms of trying to find out who did what way back when. It's an airport in the middle of a farmer's field, and we know that there was a training facility on there, and we have people who used to work there who testified on our behalf that said, in fact, these activities occurred when the federal government owned the property. Again, nonprofits don't have the ability to go back in time. They won't be able to do their due diligence in terms of hiring firms to go out and find that information. And I understand that we can only deal with the information that we have in hand at the time when those land transfers take place. However, I think it's incumbent on the federal government to take responsibility for some of these legacy issues that come up, and they're a surprise, right? I mean, oftentimes, I come from Hamilton. We've used and abused many of our waterfront lands for industrial purposes, for good reason. The steel that we built in Hamilton has built not just our city, our province, but our country and many other parts of the world. But there are surprises that come up. And I'm just looking for you for some kind of hope that there's an opportunity to change the legislation that doesn't make nonprofit housing providers jump through hoops in order to get the compensation they deserve when a surprise comes up. And I know you're not lawyers, and I respect your right to this is all, everyone's trying to deal with risk and those issues that come with it, and sometimes there's a hefty price tag. But the current system doesn't work for many, and I'm just looking for recommendations that might improve the legislation that we have now so that others don't have to face the same. Sorry, Mr. Chair.
I'll take them in writing. Yeah. Okay, it looks like you're going to get something in writing someday. Okay. That brings the second round to a close. I propose to run a third round of questions. And I think Mr. Tolmie is up, but I need guidance from the Liberals. Which is it? Vivian? Okay, and then at the end, you? Okay. So with that, we'll start with Mr. Tolmie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'd just like to piggyback on something that my colleague, Ms. Gallant, brought up earlier on. I spent some time in the UK, in London, and there'd be number of times when they would shut down parts of a block or a city because of unexploded bombs that had been dropped in World War II, and they were considered dangerous. They weren't considered dormant. They were considered a risk to the community around them. And so when Ms. Gallant asked the question earlier on about a base that is located in her riding, I was a little disappointed that, there was some questions about where she was going and the fact that there could be things like anthrax, nerve gas, even mustard gas that may be located in a site on or close to the base, and that there might be people that are exposed to that, and that they're going to be remediating that. And so I don't care whether it's 100 years or 50 years. I think that's a concern, and that's a valid concern that should be brought up. And so I would like to know, are those chemicals on your list? Anthrax, mustard gas, nerve gas, any types of agents that the military, sarin, anything that the military may have been used or?
For my part, I would have to look and ask our experts about those types of chemicals, and I say that in part because those are not the common types of contaminants that we find on the vast majority of federal contaminated sites. So, for my part, I think I could take that question away and send a response back to the committee. They're not the type of contaminants that we see. This may be, in some cases, the first time I've ever heard of them in a federal context of a contaminated site, and so we'd have to look into it.
Well, and so, just bringing it full circle here, this where we have concerns is, are there chemicals that the military uses that are not on your list? And how do they disclose that to Environment Canada, the Treasury Board, to Health Canada? How do we know, is there a set standard that the federal government has put in place that all departments are required to answer or identify?
I can, thanks for the question. I can say that under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, there is a list of chemicals, inventory of chemicals that is permitted in Canada, whether it be private entities or federal jurisdictions that are allowed to be using those. Anything that's not on that list would have to be notified to both Environment and Climate Change Canada and Health Canada before their market access. So there is a well-defined list of chemicals that are currently used in Canadian commerce, including at D&D bases, and those are actively being assessed both at Environment and Climate Change Canada and Health for their risks.
Okay. So I want to say for the record, I understand, that you're trying to put in a standard. Right? That's important. It's important for the safety of employees. It's important for the safety of the Department of National Defense. The concern I have is where are the gaps, and how can we address them in this committee to prevent other people in the future being exposed to chemicals that could be toxic? And is there a plan that you have going forward to identify chemicals that are not on your list? So do you have a plan in place for that the military, the Department of National Defense is following?
Thank you for the question. I think part of the space that these questions are in now, it will be good to hear from D&D about, in that we're probably into some occupational health and safety, as well as some types of issues that are, may be in more of a uniquely defense space. So I will suggest that the process for identifying, chemicals of concern, and I may refer this question to Greg in a moment. There is the chemicals management plan that the federal government has. Health Canada and Environment Canada co-lead that. It is not my particular area of focus, but it is a longstanding program that's been working through the many industrial chemicals that have been developed over the last 100 years, and identifying and learning about those so as to understand the risk to human health and the environment. And so, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Tolmie. The Defense Department is coming next Tuesday.
I'm going to be here.
Well, we'll look forward to it. Yeah.
You're a good chair.
Yeah. Not a universally held opinion, by the way. But that's a question that probably should be directed to D&D, because I think it's quite a legitimate question of, do they have a list? Ms. Lapointe, 5 minutes.
Chair. So I have to say that I would be remiss as the Member of Parliament for Sudbury not to take this opportunity to highlight one of the most remarkable remediation projects in the world, and that's the regreening of Sudbury. And my question is directed to you, Mr. Kane. The initiative of the regreening of Sudbury has transformed a once heavily contaminated environment, which negatively impacted our air, our water, our soil, and consequently the health of our residents, our wildlife, as well as our natural ecosystems. So, having witnessed what it does take to reverse such damage on such a large scale, I'm very keen to learn more about your processes. How could you outline for the committee how Environment and Climate Change Canada approaches large-scale remediation projects, and what are the key steps involved in tackling these types of challenges?
Thank you for the question. There are multiple success stories coming from the Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plan, and I think D&D will be well placed to speak to some of the successes that it's had in some detail. These major types of situations like you're speaking to in Sudbury are complex and are often the result of decade-long efforts to assess, plan, and clean up sites, and then provide nature time to sort of recuperate and to fully restore. I think I would invite D&D when they're here to speak to their efforts in Esquimalt in the harbor there, where 200 years worth of industrial and various activities has created multiple hotspots and difficulties, both for the harbor, for First Nations, and after extended efforts, there's signs of returning sea life to Esquimalt Harbor. So there are those types of cases. And, Hamilton Harbor is another place where through work on the Great Lakes Action Plan, there's been significant work to contain and restore it. That's a site that has been worked on outside of FICSAT, but certainly, a very long collaborative effort with the city, the province, and there are certainly many more like that. So a lot of good work being done, certainly across D&D and other partners.
And can you tell us, how does your department collaborate with other federal entities or stakeholders to address contamination challenges? And how do you ensure efficient use of resources?
So the FICSAT program, I think, is really the heart of how we work collaboratively. It is a horizontal initiative involving expert science departments providing the sort of guidance and expertise that can be the basis for custodians to know and plan and understand risks. We use a common set of nationally used classification approaches that were developed by the CCME, and that set of tools allows the custodians to be able to identify the sites that pose the higher risk to human health and the environment. And per Treasury Board policy, custodians must then focus on those sites first as a general rule. So it is that collaborative effort of basing the program on sound science, of assessing sites first to understand the sort of contaminants that are there, and then, relying on expertise both inside of custodians, the private sector, and in departments to develop the right types of remediation and risk management plans, and then make sure that they make sense. Poor decisions can cost a lot of money, and good decisions can save a lot of money. So working together, I think, is at the heart of it.
And Ms. Evans, I have a similar question to you. How does the Treasury Board Secretariat work with the many federal departments to establish priority projects and achieve measurable results?
So as my colleague indicated, we have a common set of standards, which is something that we work together on, not just across federal departments, but also with provinces and municipalities in order to have that set standard, which is established, as my colleague indicated, by the Canadian Council of Ministers for the Environment. And then we use the tools within the Treasury Board policy instruments to ensure that all of the custodians are working together, and the governance, which is led by my colleagues in Environment and Climate Change Canada, really makes sure that we're bringing people together, and that's supported by ourselves within the Treasury Board Secretariat.
And can you provide the committee, do I have time?
I do heartily endorse Ms. Lapointe's view on Sudbury. It's quite a remarkable transformation. I would even say miraculous, especially for those of us who were ensconced in the luxury of the Holiday Inn that time. So, 5 minutes, Madame Normandine.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Perhaps I could piggyback on that with regard to the recommendations that are made to the custodians. I understand that it is not a coercive measure. It's just the recommendations that are made. It's up to the custodian to move forward or not. Unless there are some other people who can impose certain things, it is a custodian who decides whether the recommendations are going to implement it or not. Is that correct?
Custodians are responsible for meeting applicable federal laws, regulations, if the contamination is onto non-federal lands, provincial or territorial regulations may apply. And so It is working to meet those standards and guidelines. It's not always as simple as a black-white type of answer, but that's ultimately what they are expected to meet, and yeah.
Et au niveau des
And with regard to the recommendations that you make, are they public? Are they confidential information? Like, is there solicitor-client privilege? Can we get access to them through an access to information request?
Question correctly, like, is the information available? Can it be made available through, say, an access to information? I would say generally yes, unless there's a particular security element or something, information can be made available. One of the roles that Health Canada has helped FICSAP with is to communicate risks. The risks associated with a particular contaminant or groups of contaminants are not always obvious. They can vary greatly depending on the sort of length of exposure, the particular maybe demographic or person. And so I think it's just important to keep in mind that communicating responsibly is part of the role of the program and of government to, yes, share and be transparent, but also provide context. Otherwise, things can be more frightening than they are actually, in fact, once there's the proper context.
Merci.
Thank you. When there's contamination that spreads out of a federal property, there is a possibility that there would be another site of contamination, that the contamination can from a place other than the federal property. So who is the person that you have to contact to determine what the source of the contamination is? I mean, you could say, oh, it isn't the federal government, it's a neighboring business, for example. Who is responsible for determining the source of the contamination?
Thanks for the question. So, there is very clear guidance on how to delineate contamination. There's a lot known of these chemicals, how they behave in the environment, how they behave in groundwater and soil, how they move throughout based on the geology and other characteristics. So, I think it's well understood the source of contamination at these sites. Based on that very science rigorous process of identifying the concentrations and how they're, moving across a property. If they delineate, if they move from a federal land into a provincial space, clearly then that building landowner gets engaged. The province in question also gets engaged, and it's a very collaborative process from that perspective.
Mais ma question plus spécifiquement, si on a une information.
But my specific question is, if you get some information that says that the federal land or the federal government is not responsible for the contamination, it's a private business, who would to deal with that?
Federal lands, the general answer would be province and territory would be the correct authority to refer a question to as a landowner and to work with the relevant province and their authorities, be it their Department of Environment or whomever, to understand and to investigate.
Encore une fois, je pense que ça répond pas à ma question.
That doesn't quite answer my question. Let's say we're told that on a federal property there was contamination, but we're told that no, it's not that, it's someone else that contaminated us. Who will conduct the inquiry or the assessment in that case?
Just be quite understanding the question, and I'm going to listen again just with the translation in case I'm missing a nuance. I do apologize.
Alors, il peut arriver.
Okay, occasionally there could be information there is a federal site that is the source of contamination for something that is not federal. Take the example of Bagotville and the city in Saguenay. Let's say that at the federal level, we get information that there is a different source of contamination other than the federal government, like a private business. Who would have carried out the study to determine that it could have been a source other than the federal land or federal government that was the source of the contamination?
So, building on part of earlier responses from me and from Mr. Caro, the type of hydrologic type modeling is able to really help us to understand where contamination, how it moves in the environment. There are ultimately that analysis, I think, would have been done by, in this case, in the case that you're thinking of, National Defense. But custodians work with local municipalities, with provinces to identify other potential sources of contaminants. Be they a garage, a repair shop, other groups that use chemicals of this nature, and from there you can start to identify those other sources and then how much they may have contributed to a given issue.
We're going to have to leave the answer. That was a very long 5 minutes. All right. Madame Matson, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Just to go back a little bit when we were talking about these workplace exposures and things that you have to deal with and try to assess. People, they're working every day. They may not understand. They may not be made aware of the toxicity of the things that they're working with, and then time goes by, and they have these longer term side effects. You had mentioned, that communication is very, very important. That conversation, that awareness is consistently there, but just in terms of beyond, a long-term cancer risk, there are so many different kinds of exposures. There's reproductive health. And people might not directly attribute it to their workplace. They may see other things. They may try and look at human history, family history, all of these things. So what assessments being done? What is the federal government doing to ensure that communication is happening actively so that workers truly understand in federal workplaces that they are potentially in an exposed state? They are exposed, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. And Health Canada does not play a role in occupational health and safety space, but can offer that. There is a very elaborate occupational health and safety program across the country, both delivered from provinces and territories and at the federal government through Labour Canada. Department of National Defense officials could speak more eloquently about how they communicate risks to workers that may be at their facilities, whether they be just regular practices from day-to-day activities or from exposures from contaminated sites. Again, there's a well-defined list of chemicals that are currently in commerce. There's a well-identified body of science that understands the risks. That is evolving. But the basis of current occupational health and safety program is reliant on the basis of decades of science that understands how these chemicals and other risks that may be present in the workplace.
In my writing, the Department of National Defense owns a property. It used to be an ordnance depot. It's directly now beside the site of where they're building a large amount of housing. There's a community park. It's quite an active area. I found out when I started to look at the potentials of the use of Department D&D land as building housing on and the uses of it. I discovered that it's listed under the Federal Contaminated Sites Inventory. It's an active site of chlorinated volatile organic compounds, contamination with high priority for action. Now, the government spent nearly $18 million on remediation of this site. There's been 38,600 metric tons of soil treated, 48.5 million liters of contaminated water. Can you comment on the scope of this site? And then what you would have expected from your departments, the the custodian, D&D, to have communicated to the community with that, related to the scope of that contaminated site?
Thank you for the question. Environment and Climate Change Canada, and I think I know the site that you're referencing, the Highbury complex maybe. It's not a site that we've been involved in. It's not an area where D&D needed advice from us about ecological risks, and so I can't really offer specific perspectives about that site and how D&D has managed it, other than to say at a high level that it has followed the standard steps of proceeding through assessment, planning, remediation, and we understand it's closer to the finish line now than it is to the starting line, but the details would have to be spoken to by D&D.
So that doesn't really answer, and maybe it's something that you can't. However, I asked about, is that in your expert opinion, is that a large site? And how are the dangers of that site, the potential risks and so on, how would they related to the size of that site? How are they communicated to the public in that area? And then I guess I would ask, are they public? Is that consultation public?
Questions and overtime. Okay, can you answer those briefly?
Have to be asked of National Defense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Ms. Gallant, 5 minutes.
Okay, there's a confirmation of PFAS contamination on base Petawawa. What would be the short, long-term consequences of PFAS exposure? And this site was specifically on Garrison Petawawa's firefighting training area.
Thank you very much for the question. So, I mean, PFAS is well characterized, as I've explained earlier in some of the comments I've made. There's a well-defined body of science that shows effects on health, including on multiple organisms and systems, including liver, kidneys, thyroid, immune, nervous system, and reproductive and developmental effects. The risks from PFAS have been well characterized in a lot of the science publications that have been put forward. I don't know the specifics necessarily of the Petawawa base, but I can say a drinking water quality objective has been established by Health Canada that identifies a threshold by which would be the expectation of all provincial, municipal, and federal entities to strive towards. That would not mean a single exceedance would cause a dramatic health effects. However, it's exposure over time that we would be concerned at increasing the health risks of the issues I just outlined.
Okay, I went, how would they even capture or make the observation of the health effects versus that contaminant in the soil? Like, these are types of conditions that would occur as a regular consequence of firefighting, cancer, et cetera. So has there been a study done looking at the medical records of firefighters, former firefighters, existing firefighters, and comparing it to the potential consequences of their being exposed to it? Like, or is that something that has been done?
Yeah, so thank you very much for the question. So firefighters has been identified as a population that's been more disproportionately impacted by a lot of chemicals and concerns, not just PFAS, but also other chemicals and issues of concerns. The federal government has looked at, biomonitoring data and cancer rates amongst firefighters. There's just recently a firefighter action plan that this federal government has put forward that assesses a variety of chemicals that are more predominantly exposed to firefighters. So in short, it's clear that firefighters are, a vulnerable population as it relates to chemicals exposures, and the actions that I think have been put forward to reduce PFAS are geared towards minimizing the exposure to the entire population, but also firefighters.
Is there anything to suggest that the contaminated sites on Canadian Armed Forces bases would have been excavated and carried off-site for any reason?
So Thank you for the question. It is common practice in contaminated sites management to exhume contaminated soils and to move those to a certified disposal facility.
If there was a new construction going on and, they didn't have this money available, they just needed to dig the hole and do something with the soil, would that stay on base or would they just get rid of it and for whoever was willing to pay for the fill?
I'm unable to speak to the...
All right. Then with the contamination and the firefighters, we know that there's also the ranges, and there are decades of spent ammunition and lead in the soil, and so much so that the ranges are no longer able to be used because there are depressions. And if we have to send soldiers off to war or to monitor a hot zone, it'd be nice if they knew how to shoot. But in Petawawa, they've had to close down a number of the ranges because they're just all sinking down from the contamination. So, what plans are there to decontaminate these range sites so that they can be rebuilt and our soldiers can use the range for practicing shooting?
I don't think I'm not aware of the details of D&D's plans for remediating any of its ranges.
So it's only chemicals, not the spent ammunition or anything that would have leached from the ammunition that is being ameliorated at this time.
To the specifics, my general understanding is D&D has a specific program for unexploded ordinances in addition to the federal contaminated sites program. But in terms of the details for the specific sites, the D&D officials would be best placed to provide that for
Any
you.
money for that? No.
Soldiers that can shoot, it's a concept. Ms. Lalonde.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and through you, I want to say thank you for your appearance today. Maybe, Mr. Kane, I hope this question's you'll be able to answer. I was made aware of the work that the government is doing under the Chemical Management Plan on the current state of the science for PFAS in Canada. The government made a science-based decisions to exempt a class of, and I'll have to read, fluoropolymer, I'm not an expertise in those big words, from the scope of that report. Actually, can you explain to this committee what those substances are and the rationale behind that decisions to isolate the group of chemistries? And if you could also please remind us what the next steps are under the process for focus on substance of concerns, please.
Thank you very much for the question. I'll certainly respond on behalf of. So indeed, there is a recent report that published the scientific findings of the class of perfluorinated alkyl substances. Based on that assessment, to determine that there was a subclass for which there was a certain amount of uncertainty on both the health and environmental effects of that subclass within that broader class of PFAS chemicals. So there's a certain threshold by which is defined under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act to take regulatory action on this class of chemicals, and it was felt that further analysis is required on that subclass prior to making a full scientific determination. In terms of a path forward, there has been a commitment to add fluoropolymers to the plan of priorities, which is a requirement under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act that has a commitment to undertake an assessment in the near future of that subclass of fluoropolymers to determine whether or not they do have any health or environmental effects.
Thank you very much, and I apologize to Mr. Kane, Mr. Caro, very thoughtful answer. A quick follow-up, if I may. There's also and I think you mentioned a subgroup of PFAS substances that are known substitutes to the Kigali substances, and the government has expressed its concern about regrettable substitutions, which is a valid concern for sure. I'm told that certain industry players are concerned about a possible need to find a substitute for a substitute after millions of dollars in investment. Can you explain to the committee what the process to find viable alternatives alternatives entails and what regulatory makers or exemptions that government will consider as we work to find the lowest impact alternative for an undesirable chemistry.
For the question, so indeed, a regrettable substitution has been an area that has been a concern from government officials, industry, and all Canadians, I would say. An approach moving forward is that chemical assessments is being done from more of a class-based approach that understands similar chemistry, similar mode of action, similar uses to being able to identify which of those may be a concern, which of those may not. And that would give predictability to industry on where there are chemistries that there is concerns from an environmental or human health perspective and those that will not. There's also a new mechanism under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act called a watch list that lists chemicals for which there may be concerns from a health and environmental perspective. That is a communication mechanism for industry and Canadians to stay away from that chemistry, recognizing the concerns that we have. So that's a basis upon which investments in alternatives can be made that would not be in areas of concern identified by the government.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Evans, I just had a conversation. I just wanted to know, we talked a lot about each of the roles and everything, but there was a few mention of the collaboration between provincial and territorial government in addressing contaminated site and role. What is the role that they play? Can you just please tell us in a little bit more detail as to how does that work in practical term of that collaboration from either each of you or particularly from Mrs. Evans?
So I can get started and then I'll turn it to my colleagues from the expert departments. So when we're setting our standards and our policy for all custodians to follow, we want to make sure that we're setting something that meets the federal as well as aligned with provincial and municipal standards. And so what I referenced was the Canadian Council of Ministers for the Environment. They're who set those standards, and we reference those within Treasury Board policy to ensure that those common standards apply to all federal custodians. And then in terms of practically how it works, I'll turn to my colleagues from the expert departments.
Thank you for the question. And to build on that, those standards are set by a working group under the council. It's a Contaminated Sites Working Group. It has federal, provincial, territorial participants. Environment Canada, another part of the department, is a lead for that. And we work closely with Health Canada. So in setting those guidelines, we're looking to, as Sarah mentioned, set standards that make sense for the country and are going to be used widely.
A point of order. How exciting. Yes.
So I believe that Ms. Evans explained something about the UXO removal. There's a difference between the UXO program and actually the spent ammunition, and the spent ammunition has lead in it and leaching into the ground. So they're two different things. And when you come back with the answers, I would hope that that distinction would be made.
I don't think that was anywhere as close to a point of order, but it might be a point of clarification. So if it needs clarification, we'll leave it to you to do so. Before I let you go, to clean up a contaminated site, is that a Crown liability or a department liability?
So through the annual reporting process for the federal contaminated sites inventory, all of the departments report their liabilities on a site-by-site basis, and then that's rolled up as part of the public accounts and is reported as a liability of the Crown.
And the contamination cleanup, does that come out of department budget or come out of some other budget?
So the Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plan is an overarching program, and within that program, each department has a specific allocation. But in terms, as you've noted, it essentially balances it out to a certain extent. So we're reducing liability while we're making those investments.
I'm not sure I follow that. So if I've got a $100 million cleanup at Ms. Gallant's site, is that coming out of D&D's budget, or is that coming out of some other budget?
So there's a specific program budget for the Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plan program. There is a portion of the remediation work that comes out of D&D's existing reference levels, but there's also funding that comes out through the Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plan program that's provided to each of the custodians to support that remediation work.
Okay. I think we need to, Ms. Lalonde seemed to be able to follow that bouncing ball. I'm not sure I was. Having said that, I just want to, on behalf of the committee, thank you for your appearance here today and the economical use of your time in giving your opening remarks. So thank you. With that, colleagues, we're about to adjourn. Minister Duclos and colleagues will be here on Thursday, and then we resume this study next Tuesday and next Thursday. So with that, meeting adjourned.